So we're going to have our first session, our first guest. This is Venkatesh Rao. Just guys at the back, as we come off stage, if we can lower the lights at the front, just to make the screen brighter, thank you. So Venkatesh Rao is a writer and consultant. He wrote the widely read Ribbonfarm blog from 2007 to 2024, and more recently, the popular Ribbonfarm Studio Substack newsletter. He's the author of Tempo, a book on timing and decision-making. He's been an independent consultant since 2011, supporting senior executives in the technology industry. Venkat holds a PhD in control theory from the University of Michigan. Venkat coined some of the most astute observational phrases in recent memory, from Cosy Web to Permaweird to, as Hannah just mentioned, global narrative collapse. So in this interview, which I've conducted with Venkat, and which has been edited and also visually texturized by Y7, Venkat reflects on the role that chaos has played in the ideologies that are promising endless tech-enabled progress. But the question is, at what and at whose cost? So will you please welcome, albeit virtually and through a video recording, Venkatesh Rao, and really hope you enjoy this afternoon. Thank you. Play the video, please.
Venkat, hi. Thanks so much for joining us at the Global Art Forum 2025, the new normal. Where are you speaking from today?
I am in Kirkland, just outside of Seattle.
Fantastic. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you, something I've wanted to do for a long time. And I know we have a number of mutual friends, interlocutors. So myself and Y7, who I'm curating the Global Art Forum with this year, were super keen to kind of hear from you around some of the kind of ideas and thoughts that we've been having, but also to kind of try and put them in relation to a number of ideas and concepts that you've had for the last several years. And we felt like this was like the perfect way for us to frame this edition of the Global Art Forum. So just to kick things off, we are calling it the new normal. And one of the qualities of this new normal is that chaos feels indistinguishable from progress. And what I'd like to know from you, Venkat, is your thoughts perhaps about the relationship between chaos and magical thinking, which is a term that I know you've lent on a lot over several years. And this relationship between chaos and magical thinking, both as something historical, but also as something that pertains to our kind of tech-dominated present.
Yeah, I think it's a very powerful and temperamental lens to look at the world through, and it can be used for good or evil, as I like to say. But in the modern era, I would say the biggest sort of representative of consequential magical thinking is probably Silicon Valley. So Silicon Valley, even though its economic powerhouse engine is based on science and technology, it's fundamentally a kind of like Gnostic, Hermetic kind of tradition based on a flavor of magical thinking that has big consequences. Like Trump represents another kind of magical thinking, but it sort of cancels itself out. It's like noisy in the moment, but and consequential in like political terms. But the kind of magical thinking that goes on in Silicon Valley is the kind that has like centuries-long effects, not just a decade or two. You've got lots of magical thinking, including like quite literally in-your-face magical thinking, like AGI becoming conscious. It's like the most shoddy thinking about like philosophy of mind and consciousness that you can imagine. And it's like, cartoon reasoning drawn from science fiction. Yet you cannot deny that all these people who are doing very shoddy philosophy of mind, they are building extremely deep technology, right? Modern AI is like really powerful. And to your point about like chaos and progress, I think this is how actually progress happens. You cannot separate the two. So we are in that mode of like a lot more magical thinking in the mix than is wise or desirable, but it is what it is. So
Mhm.
it is going to be noisy and anxiety provoking for a while.
And I want to sort of try and extend this to one of your viral concepts from a number of years ago, which is the Permaweird. We could also say that the Permaweird is maybe another name for the new normal. So I wonder if you could tell us what you meant by the Permaweird when you first coined it, and whether you think this is something that's been new normalized now.
So the point of the coinage is that it cannot be normalized. So in a way, I'm presenting an anti or counter thesis to what you guys are claiming. And the reasoning behind it is that, just to historicize this a little bit, the epochs, as I see it, is you kind of had normalcy until about 2015, then essentially Trump getting elected. And I like the marker of Harambe, the gorilla getting killed in the Cincinnati Zoo. That's my memetic marker of when normalcy ended. Then you had what I call the Great Weirding. So I have a series of essays that I may never finish about it. But the Great Weirding started with the death of Harambe, and it ended with COVID pandemic. And the COVID pandemic was the beginning of what I call the Permaweird. Now, what do I mean by Permaweird? It's useful to get at it in a negative way. What do we mean by normalcy, right? So normalcy is just a large-scale consensus about this is the way things are. So if you're in a city like say New York or London, and 80% of people seem to live a certain way within a certain consensus understanding of reality, there is a sense in which there is a normalcy in London. It may not be the same as normalcy in Dubai or the normalcy in Seattle, but they're like normalcies. And maybe in a larger cosmopolitan world, they get connected. And if you move to a different city, you might experience a little bit of culture shock, but it's still kind of the same larger family of normalcies, right? But as the, how do I put it, the dimensionality of life and experience start to like explode, like it's no longer a low dimensional life, but lots and lots of dimensions of experience. So you pick a city and you pick randomly, say 50 people off the streets of London walking by and talk to them about how do you live your life, what do you believe about the world and so forth. I don't know what you'll find, I'm just speculating this. But my suggestion is now compared to 50 years ago, the majority view is going to be a much smaller view. So in the past, you might have found that 80% of people kind of had the same worldview. Now you might find that it's less than a absolute majority of 50%, like maybe 30%, right? That's what I mean by the Permaweird, that we are in a state now where, yeah, maybe you and your 5 friends can agree about the way the world is, but there is no such thing as normalcy because reality is too high dimensional. You and I might, we have mutual friends in the art circuit, as you've mentioned. If we are in a gathering with like 10 people we mutually know, that's a bubble of consensus reality that is well short of the majority needed to create normalcy. And as we maybe sit through a 2-day workshop talking, it is going to get interrupted. People are going to come in, the filter is going to, not filter collapse, context collapse. That's the word people use. The context is going to like collapse at like an alarming frequency. So think of context collapse not as like you have this perfect bubble of reality that collapses once and for all, but as like this balloon that you keep reinflating with your local beliefs, and then it keeps getting punctured with new stuff. That new stuff that keeps collapsing your reality, that's weirdness. And the Permaweird is a larger environmental condition where the half-life of a normalcy bubble, even a small local one, is counted in days or weeks, not months or years. Definitely not lifetimes or careers, right? So enjoy your 10% normalcy bubble for the next week before the next piece of weirdness collapses it or punctures it, and then you have to reinflate your little bubble, right? So that's what I mean by the Permaweird.
The Corona scene began exactly 5 years ago this month. You wrote an entry on Ribbonfarm on the 9th of March 2020 entitled Plot Economics, which at the time really helped me frame what was happening to us at the time as it was happening to us, minute by strange minute. You said that we were undergoing global narrative collapse and that during this period, quote, everyone temporarily abandons attempt to reach narrative consensus. Did global narrative collapse also become part of our new normal, and with it, the complete disappearance of consensus-based reality?
I think it did. And honestly, even though it's very anxiety provoking, I think it's the right outcome in both senses of the word right, as in the logical consequences of like the physics like dynamics of what's happening, and kind of the morally right direction for things to be going, even though it might not seem like it. So to take those in order in terms of like it being the right answer in physics terms, I like the imagery of like a large bubble collapsing into a bunch of smaller bubbles, right? So this is like the physics of surface tension. The amount of energy the surface of a bubble holds is proportionate to the area. And if you have a condition where there's not enough energy to sustain a large bubble, it is going to collapse into a smaller bubble. So that's kind of how bubbles evolve. So it's the physics of bubbles. So global narrative collapse, you've got decentralized polycentric narratives evolving, talking to each other. I've started calling these protocol narratives because in a way, it's almost like a set of computers chattering at each other over TCP/IP. And a lot of the work I do now is around protocols. So it's been a very fertile frame for me. So I would say the way I would think about narrative collapse is you had one big narrative, it then collapsed and atomized into a whole bunch of small narratives that were not even talking to each other. Not only were they inconsistent, they were like unwilling and unable to talk to each other. Now we are getting to a point where they're starting to talk to each other, right? So we used to talk 50 years ago about interfaith dialogues between religions. So that's like the big institutional bubble version of this. I'm talking about the small micro bubble froth version of this, right? Like this little group of 20 artists imagining the future and that little group of 20 technologists imagining the future, both have some mix of like hyperstition and empirical reality-based thinking going on. They're going to disagree, but that's not necessarily a desirable state or one you should necessarily work towards together. I think, to stick with our bubble metaphor, the landscape of bubbles should reflect reality. If reality does in fact admit a large consensus, it should be a large bubble. But if reality does in fact only support like lots of little bubbles, that's kind of the landscape we should end up in. Yeah, so that's what I think of narrative collapse. It's anxiety provoking to live this way, but I think it's ultimately going to make us stronger and better.
A question from my colleagues at Y7. They would like you to give an outline of your theory of Lovecraftian and Ballardian epochs of technology, and which one are we in right now?
So there's a third one there. It's a Labatutian. So there's a three-phase historical model. And I first rolled this out, I think, in a talk in Singapore a few years ago. But yeah, the basic idea is that when you encounter like a new frontier of like absolutely new empirical reality, right? Like talking about the Renaissance, when Galileo first turned an actual telescope towards the skies and noticed the moons of Jupiter and the phases of Venus, that's the kind of moment I mean, a Galilean moment. So an empirical eruption of a new reality, encounters of this sort that completely shatter whatever mix of magical thinking and reality-based thinking you have going on. You encounter something new that shatters it completely, right? This is what I call the Labatutian moment after Benjamin Labatut, who wrote this wonderful book called When We Cease to Understand the World. This is just a few years ago, like 2020 or something. So this is the Labatutian phase. And in his book, he talks about like a large number of physicists who went through this experience. So it's like a quasi-fictionalized work. So, you know, people like Schrodinger, Karl Schwarzschild, who came up with the idea of black holes, all these people who thought new, previously unthinkable thoughts for the first time when encountering the provocation of like the truly, genuinely new, something humanity had never encountered before. That's the Labatutian moment, right? Destroys your world and usually drives people insane. And many physicists, famous physicists of the 20th century did go insane with their Labatutian encounters. The next phase that comes along is Lovecraftian. And Lovecraft himself is an interesting figure because he did his work right after Einstein's relativity kind of like exploded on the scene and like upended everybody's views. And it's hard for us to imagine 100 years later just how traumatizing the Einsteinian moment was for all traditions of thought and culture, right? But Lovecraft was a writer who came from that moment, and his idea of cosmic horror is kind of a first pass narrative processing of the unthinkable. So Labatutian moment is you can't think about it at all. But then the first time you're able to manage to think about it at all, you have this cosmic horror way of thinking about it. And he has like turns of phrase that are not at all scary to us in 2025. Like there's in the Call of Cthulhu, there's this line about oblique angles that look acute. Yeah, that's like, relativistic geometry. Let the mathematicians worry about that. I'll understand it as best as I can. It's not a scary thought, right? But imagine you're in 1925 and your entire world is getting upended. I can imagine that would actually have been a scary thought, like, ghost scary. So that's the Lovecraftian moment. You process through your sense of like visceral unease, the future nausea that I talked about, the sense of like raw, unfactored reality that has not yet been turned into a manufactured normalcy field. So you're almost throwing up, you're nauseated. The Lovecraftian phase does that nausea, right? And at some point, the horror, the cosmic horror of it all becomes so familiar, it becomes banal. And that's when you switch into a Ballardian phase. And all of J.G. Ballard's science fiction kind of reflects this sensibility. In many ways, many of the individual stories, in fact, mirror themes of Lovecraftian stories, but they're presented as kind of like bureaucratic and banal and not scary, unless you stop to think about it and like poke a little. And then just lurking between the Ballardian, beneath the Ballardian banality, the Lovecraftian horror is still there. And beneath that, the Labatutian unprocessed new reality is still there. So it's not like you've finished the job of understanding reality. You may not understand it, but you normalize it. So the three layers, the Labatutian sort of like uncomprehending horror, the Lovecraftian cosmic horror, and Ballardian banality, there are three layers that almost like buffer you against the raw experience. And that's almost the experience of normalizing the unfamiliar, which is not the same as understanding it or mastering it.
And you wrote last year on contraptions in a very interesting piece that refuted the idea that we are in permacrisis or polycrisis. There are sort of different terms for this. And you wrote, quote, "I suspect it is better to think of normalcy and crisis as paired kinds of magical thinking that define imaginaries of the present," end quote. You touched on the relationship with magical thinking earlier, but this I'm very taken by this phrase, imaginaries of the present. Could you sort of expand a little bit about that and why normalcy and crisis are paired together this way?
So there's two ways to look at that. One is kind of the Baudelairean approach, which is there is no reality. It's just like simulation simulating each other. And it's a whirl of subjectivities, and there's no reality out there to even access, right? I think this is nonsense. This is like people up their own asses, honestly. But there is no simple matter of like accessing reality. So to your point about the intertwined evolution of crisis and normalcy as like almost a double helix of imaginaries. That's kind of the mental image I have in mind. So Permaweird is my term for capturing the sense of double helix of normality and chaos. But how does a pair of imaginaries come about? I would say the normalcy imaginary actually follows this Labatutian, Lovecraftian, Ballardian process, right? Periodically, you encounter new things. It's like completely unsettling at first, then you normalize it, and then it encounters a new reality. It collapses, it rebuilds itself. That's one process. That's normalcy as like a historical up and down cycle of just keep reinflating the bubble of normalcy, right? But this is fundamentally the magical thinking strand because it's not actually really strongly connected to using empiricism to get yourself entangled with reality. It's like occasionally reality bursts your bubble and then you have to reinflate the bubble, but then you can go back to just being in the bubble, right? And this creates that other strand, and it's still an imaginary, but it's not an imaginary in the sense of a normalcy. It's an imaginary in the sense of a sense of like unsettled, um, the ground beneath your feet not being firm, being anchored in doubt rather than certainty. So there's another perhaps simpler way of thinking about it. You need one foot on each of the strands of the double helix, and they wind yin-yang style. And you kind of need that, and it's anxiety provoking, but that's the only way you can process being and becoming in 2025.
Anyway, Venkat, thank you so much for your time and joining us at the Global Art Forum. And I think also on behalf of the world, we want to thank you for 17 years of ribbon farming. And what an incredible archive that has been. So, Venkat, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.